Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Dennis Prager Show. Let me take
Sure.
some of the examples that you cited. First, most of the Indians, by all the scholarship that I have seen, and I often cite the Indian tragedy as and evil. There was evil in the way we treated the Indians.
Yes.
There's no question about it. But there's also no question that the great majority died of disease, and not deliberately inflicted disease.
Oh no, that's true. That a great majority of Indians died of disease in the 17th century when the Europeans first came here. But after that, after the American Revolution, when the colonists expanded from that thin band of colonies along the Atlantic and expanded westward, at that point we began to annihilate the Indian tribes. We committed massacres all over the
What percentage of the Indians do you believe we massacred, as opposed to diseases ravaged?
Oh, well, it might have been 10%.
Okay.
But
I'll say that, but 10% is very different from the generalization of we annihilated the Indians.
Oh, well, if the 10% is a huge number of Indians, that is, so, it's pointless, I think, to argue about whether disease or, by the way, disease brought by the Europeans.
Yeah, but not intentionally, and the Europeans brought back diseases. Attacks
killed more Indians. All that I'm saying is, because you're asking for a sort of report card
Yes.
in the United States, and I'm saying that the way we treated the Indians, and I thought you were agreeing with this, the wiping out of whole Indian villages and
but if we both agree with
that is not a high mark for the United States.
No, but 10% is very different from what the general statement of annihilate tends to indicate. That's all I am saying.
Okay.
Let me ask you this then.
Yes.
If, let's say, Europeans never came to North America and it was left in the hands of the American indigenous Indians,
yes,
do you think the world would be a better place?
I have no way of knowing.
All right, but so you're agnostic on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have no way of knowing what would have happened, and
we do have a way of knowing. If the Indians had never been intervened with, they would have continued in the life and the values of the societies that the American Indians made.
Well, I suppose we could presume that, and many of their societies were very peaceful and benign, and some of their societies were ferocious and warlike. But the point is that we very often sort of justify barging into other people's territories by the fact that we are sort of bringing civilization. But in the course of it, if in the course of bringing civilization we kill large numbers of people, which we did in that case, and which we have done in other cases, then you're led to question whether what we did deserves to be praised or condemned.
Well, you can do both. You can condemn the massacres, and you can praise the civilization that we made here. All right, so let's move on.
Democrats think of America as the government. They don't think of it as the American people or the values embodied by the American people or the founding values, which they don't like anyway. Democrats believe that the founding values merely enshrine racism, sexism, bigotry, and homophobia, that all of the Constitution, all of the Declaration of Independence was written as a way to enshrine property ownership by rich white men. This is the Howard Zinn view of history, and unfortunately it's permeated large segments of the Democratic Party. It's a real problem for Democrats. It really is. Because most Americans generally, despite this poll, most Americans still kind of like the country. And when you have this Howard Zinn view of history, that George Washington was just a rich white slave owner who had no principles, and that he wasn't risking anything in the Revolutionary War, all these guys just wanted to keep their own property. When you believe that, you throw out American history. When you treat American history as just a series of power relations, what you're really doing is undermining what America is and what makes America good. The reality is that America is the only country in human history founded on an ideal, a stated ideal, and a good ideal. The idea that all men are created equal granted inalienable rights by their creator. That is a unique proposition in human history. And the founding fathers may not have perfectly realized the manifestation of that idea, right? Slavery still existed, obviously. Many of the same people who signed the Declaration of Independence, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence was a slaveholder. But it doesn't mean that the ideal that they were promoting wasn't a good ideal. It was a great ideal. It is a great ideal. And that's why I've always objected to the folks who kneel during the national anthem. I've always objected to this idea that you have to burn the flag in order to protest. It seems to me that what you really should be doing is saying, I love the flag, and that's why I think that we're not standing up in proper ways for it. I love the national anthem. I love the country, and that's why I think that we have to fulfill that dream. This is what Frederick Douglass did so well. He did a very famous speech during the late days of slavery, before the Civil War. He did a speech, very famous 4th of July speech, in which he said, the Declaration of Independence is a magnificent document, but it doesn't protect people like me. It should protect people like me. It should be universal. Let's look at the universal implications of the ideas pushed by Thomas Jefferson, and then let's go out and act upon them. Right? That's the way that people ought to question whether we're living up to our own ideals. But the ideals themselves are good. And this Marxist idea that all politics, all principle is really just a manifestation of what you want. It's all just power relationships. That the only reason that the Constitution exists is because there are a bunch of people who want to preserve their own interests. It's just not correct. It's just not correct. It was a lot riskier for the founders to fight against the greatest empire on earth than it was for them, much riskier for them to fight that empire and put all their property at risk. I mean, the Declaration of Independence pledges their lives, their wealth, and their sacred honor, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the fight. There were founders who went legitimately broke in the course of the Revolutionary War, Robert Livingston among them, from New York. He watched his house burn to the ground. George Washington, there's a story my business partner Jeremy Boring was telling me last night. George Washington, the British were threatening Mount Vernon, and apparently one of his staffers basically went out and begged the British not to burn down Mount Vernon. When Washington found out about it, he was angry. He said, listen, I pledged my life, my fortune, my sacred honor to fight this battle. To pretend that the heroes of America's past are not actually heroes is deeply embedded in a lot of democratic ideology right now, and it's really bad.
This is Audible.
Blackstone Publishing presents Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America, by Mary Grabar. This book is read by Pam Ward, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Introduction. Howard Zinn, icon, rock star. In Good Will Hunting, an emotionally scarred 20-year-old working-class genius endorses A People's History of the United States. During his first visit to his therapist, Will Hunting looks over the books in the office and reads a title aloud, A History of the United States, Volume 1. Then comments, if you want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass. The message is clear. Zinn's history stands superior to any multi-volume history of America. A genius says so. Will is a natural genius in both math and history. In a bar scene early on in the movie, he inserts himself into a conversation in which Clark, a Harvard graduate student, is challenging a friend who is trying to start a conversation with some young women by pretending to be a Harvard student. Clark challenges Will's friend by asking if he can provide some insight into the evolution of the market economy in the early colonies. Will, observing Clark's mini-academic disquisition on the economic modalities of the southern colonies, jumps into the conversation saying, of course that's your contention. You're a first-year grad student. You just finished some Marxian historian, Pete Garrison, probably. And you're going to be convinced of that until next month when you get to James Lemon, and you're going to be talking about how the economies of Virginia and Pennsylvania were strongly entrepreneurial and capitalist back in 1740. That's going to last until sometime next year. Then you'll be in here regurgitating Gordon Wood about, the pre-revolutionary utopia and the capital-forming effects of military mobilization. When the grad student begins quoting from the monograph Work in Essex County, Will completes his sentence and gives the page number. As the bar patrons look on with awe, Will accuses the Harvard student of trying to impress the girls and predicts that in 50 years he may start thinking for himself and realize that he has spent $150,000 for an education he could have gotten for $1.50 in library late fees. In this devastating exchange, Will has knocked down 3 historians in quick succession, leaving only the great Howard Zinn standing. Matt Damon, who played the titular character in Good Will Hunting, was a young neighbor of the Zinns in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He and his brother lived with their divorced mother, an education professor, who raised her boys with a deep social consciousness, according to Zinn. When Damon was 10, he took the family copy of the newly published People's History to school and read from it to his class for Columbus Day. And Matt Damon is far from the only American kid who was bought into Howard Zinn's take on our history. Zinn's version of our past, from the discovery of America, Columbus committed genocide, through slavery, worse here than anywhere in world history, the founding of the United States, white slave owners scheming to preserve the status quo, World War II, the Allies weren't any better than the Nazis, and Vietnam, yay, plucky commies defeat the evil American war machine, is widely taught and believed. In fact, it is becoming enshrined as an integral part of young Americans' beliefs. And no wonder. A people's history is taught throughout our schools and colleges. A young people's history of the United States, Zinn's history adapted for middle schoolers with simplified sentences, but the same content, tells young readers that Zinn's radically different version of history was adapted for them because of parents' and teachers' demands. But some adults might object because they feel that young people are not mature enough to look at their nation's policies honestly. If students aren't given Zinn's book, they may read passages from his work in other books. For example, if they check out young adult books by John M. Dunn from the library on such historical topics as the Vietnam War, the North American Indians, and the Civil Rights Movement. Each of those volumes contains extended passages from A People's History of the United States, which is listed in the works consulted, and is described as an unorthodox history told from the perspectives that are often overlooked by mainstream writers. Dunn presented Zinn as a respected historian, and there's good evidence that the College Board, which is becoming an unelected national school board, setting curricula, and just as important, largely replacing states and localities as the shaper of both textbooks and teacher training at the high school level, via their frameworks for the Advanced Placement, AP U.S. History exam, promotes Zinn's version of history by including his books in AP teacher training seminars. For years now, teachers have used a variety of editions of A People's History with discussion questions, exercises, lesson plans, and activities. Many of these activities involve role play, a favorite in-class activity of the decidedly non-intellectual Professor Zinn. Students at San Antonio College, to give just one example, learn history from an instructor who has adapted strategies from Zinn, her mentor. I have been to many teaching conferences throughout the years where Howard Zinn's materials were promoted. One recently retired public high school history teacher in New York City, Jeffrey Ludwig, described how his fellow teachers would photocopy pages of Zinn's book, which was not on the officially approved list, for use in class. According to a college student who recently graduated from that school, teachers were still handing out excerpts from Zinn's book. Many high school students are subjected to Zinn's book in class, along with the America-hating attitude that comes with it. Emily Rentz, now CEO of a clinical trials company she founded, described her horrific experience in Jim Buxton's Global Studies and International Relations classes at South Kingston High School in Rhode Island. Buxton made students read A People's History cover to cover and write papers regurgitating its points. He also bullied students who dared to express opinions that differed from Zinn's. The grand finale was a class visit from Zinn himself, who had been presented as a kind of god when Rentz was in 11th grade in 2005. Zinn's book and visit at Rentz's high school enjoyed the blessing of many of the parents. Sam Weinberg, a professor of education at Stanford University and the executive director of the Stanford History Education Group, notes that Zinn's book has become the dominant narrative in many cases and the only history book on the syllabus for future teachers. Zinn's pervasive influence is a national tragedy, especially considering just how distorted, manipulative, and plain dishonest A People's History of the United States is. It's past time to take a closer look at Zinn's outrageous claims and outright lies, and set the historical record straight. No other historian has gotten away with as much as Zinn has.
Monstrous lie.
Unforgivable. And he knew that. He was prepared to destroy his own humanity in order to save the species. He made an incredible sacrifice.
No.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah!
That is Howard Zinn that Matthew McConaughey and Matt Damon were talking about. One of the world's greatest historians, scholars. At times he's even accused of being a non-plagiarist. And today we're talking to someone who's standing athwart the progress of a nation, who's trying to undo all the good that's been done by the work of this man. Her name is Mary Grabar. Mary's a PhD. She's an accomplished scholar and historian, and she's got a book called Debunking Howard Zinn. Mary, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, but I'm really disturbed. When I'm reading your book, I think back to all the people who told me what a great man Howard Zinn was and how this book would change my life. And here you are standing athwart history trying to say, no, it's not true. The bridge is out. How dare you, ma'am? How dare you? What brought you to this decision to spend your time writing about this?
I taught college for 20 years and noticed the corruption and the decay in it, and noticed that students didn't understand what communism was, or they thought of it as simply a Red Scare, and started writing about education and noticed Howard Zinn around 2008. And I've been monitoring him ever since, writing reports and articles. And then I started the research for this book in earnest about 2 years ago. And it was worse than I thought. I knew he was a leftist. I knew he hated America, but he commits all the sins of people who claim to be historians should not commit.
So I think there are two types of people who are going to hear this interview. There's the first type that are people I know that I talk to all the time are going to say, oh yeah, I remember Howard Zinn. What's the big deal? I don't really read him. I don't care. But I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. And there's the other types that I went on Instagram last night and it was on hashtag Howard Zinn. And I'll show some screenshots to the audience of people who said things like, this book changed my life. This is the true history they don't teach you in school. I changed my major as soon as my college professor recommended this to me. And I think those are the ones that we need to kind of focus on in terms of the effect this man has had, and playing back from the green to the T in terms of what his motivations were, what type of character he had, what are the things we don't know about him that we need to, and how he's been able to survive things that other authors had not. You talk in the book about people like Irving and Stephen Ambrose, who took a lot of shame and a lot of grief for some of the mistakes they made, and Howard Zinn didn't do that. He could just come out with another a revised issue, and all sins were immediately forgiven. So before we kind of dive into those topics, how did you've got so many things you could write. How did you decide on this? I know you said that you've the things you did earlier, but how did you decide this is the book you want to write?
Well, Howard Zinn was a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party. And I think he had the most influence. Now, he was older than the New Left. He was sort of a mentor to the New Left of the 1960s. So he was born in 1922, and he went from being a member of the Communist Party, just, dropping his official membership, but nonetheless spreading the poison of communism among the radicals and other professors. So in terms of a ripple effect, I think Howard Zinn is where it pretty much begins. And when we talk about how education and the study of history has deteriorated.
Is it fair to throw out that word communist? I mean, there was the Red Scare. You have let me see what the chapter heading is here. Chapter 6, Writing the Red Menace Out of History. Are you going to be accused of being a fascist, conspiracy theorist, McCarthyist for saying, hey, Howard Zinn was a communist, and now we can just dismiss his important impact on American history? What do you have to back that up, Ms. Grabar?
Yeah, no doubt I will, but Howard Zinn had an FBI file that was over 500 pages long, and of course, throughout his book, he attacks the FBI and says they were persecuting civil rights leaders like the Black Panthers, who were essentially terrorists. I'm not the only one who has come out and said that Howard Zinn was a communist. Ron Radosh, who was briefly a communist himself, categorically claimed, yes, that he was a communist. By looking at his file, he could tell he's a scholar. He wrote the book on the Rosenbergs. So I'm not the only one who is saying that. So, Howard Zinn, on the one hand would promote communism, but then say, I'm not a communist. He would praise it and say, but I'm not a communist. So there's a contradiction there too.
In terms of the way that you know what, I want to go back a little bit. I've got a couple things I definitely want to get into before we get back to communism. So I've got some excerpts here. In terms of talking about the reach and influence of the book, Zinn has a couple quotes I saw over social media. One is about how, and I might butcher the quote because I don't have it in front of me, it's such a radical, there's nothing more radical or revolutionary than telling the truth. And as I read through the book, chapter after chapter, I think this is a topic he's not well versed on. It's a nice quote, but how would he know that? And then another one talks about how small changes can change the world. And this idea of that anybody can change the world. This is something Jordan Peterson attacks a lot. He says, look, anyone who talks about changing the world, if they can't make their bed in the morning, they're not equipped to do much of anything, which is why they focus on big problems and not small ones, to abscond that fact. And I think, you look at all the small lies that you pointed out, and I want to get into the plagiarism, where basically he had people that were fellow travelers and ideological partners who he plagiarized, who knew about it, who said nothing. Like today, it would get you run out of, well, I hope it would get you run out of town on a rail. But the fact that these things have survived and been hidden, it really is a page turner for those of you who want to go check out the book and learn it for yourself. But in our cultural zeitgeist today, you've got, here's a quote. This country was founded on white supremacy. That's Robert Francis, Beto O'Rourke at a campaign event this year. We are living in a visible fascism ascendant. I say visible because those paying attention watch it survive and thrive under the protection of the state for decades, which is ripped directly from Howard Zinn's People, the History of the United States. That was an armed attacker who tried to bomb the ICE detention center in July. Pete Buttigieg, I think that's how you say it, said, white America needs to face the roots of inequities and the fact of systemic racism all around us. It's in the air we breathe. Your thesis is that a lot of this comes from the teachings that were incorporated in the 80s and 90s of Howard Zinn. Make your case, please.
Oh, absolutely. We've had 2 generations of parents educated on Howard Zinn, reading the book, A People's History of the United States, being taught by teachers who read the book in colleges of education, sometimes the only history book they read. They're downloading lessons. They're seeing it in movies like Good Will Hunting. Rock bands pay tribute to him. I think he was on The Daily Show, Howard Zinn, when he was alive. He's a very cool guy. I mean, he's hip. He was a celebrity. He's a rock star of a historian. And when it comes to truth, what Howard Zinn uses these very devious rhetorical strategies. He says that really he speaks directly to the reader. He says, all these other people who were telling you these things about American history, they were lying. And I am going to tell you the truth. I am going to reveal the conspiracy of silence about American history, that it was a good country that, promoted democracy and the rule of law. It's all wrong, he says. And so he kind of sweeps the reader up into this sort of mode of conspiracy, and appeals really mostly to adolescents who are in that, phase of their development where they don't trust authority. So he uses that. He's very, very skillful in that way.
Let's kind of break into some of the topics where you kind of knock down some of those straw men. You talk about the power of rhetoric and asking open questions, then answering yourself, as opposed to doing scholarly research and facts. You talk about how People's History of the United States is one of the most prominent history books in America, yet it has very few footnotes. And also there was a stat that it sells more copies year after year. I think it's up to about 2.5 million copies. And a big part of that is because it gets downloaded so often by teachers. And I saw this on social media too. You'd see people talking about how much they love the book, and then you'd see someone say, yeah, it's my favorite. It's the only one I recommend to my students. And I went, oh man, that's a future AOC classroom. But in terms of some of the specifics that I think will interest the readers the most, let's turn to the chapters and talk about things they're going to learn. The first chapter is Columbus Bad, Indians Good. And I was excited because I don't know if it's Samuel Eliot Morison or Samuel Eliason, I forget his name, but he was a Harvard professor who's considered one of the prominent scholars on Columbus. And he had a book called Admiral of the Ocean, Admiral of the Sea, which I read several chapters of last year when I was doing a Columbus Day video, which I will link to, just talking about how there's things about Columbus that really are pretty fascinating in terms of what he believed his mission was and what he had experienced in terms of this whole journey. And you basically say that Zinn butchers this and turns the narrative upside down. Can you elaborate a little bit on what people learn that perhaps they shouldn't and what they don't learn that they should?
Well, his opening pages of Columbus and his men landing and being greeted by the gentle Arawaks, which is what he calls the Indians, it's not the accurate name, who bring him gifts and food, and in return, Columbus and his men enslave them, work them to death for gold, hack off their hands. That is completely false. I looked at some of his sources. He doesn't use footnotes, but he does have a bibliography. And I noticed a book by Hans Koning. Now, Hans Koning was a comrade of Zinn's in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was not a historian. He was a novelist and a screenwriter. He was a socialist. So he wrote this little screed for high school students without any footnotes or research about Columbus. That was published in 1976. Well, Howard Zinn in his opening pages plagiarizes from that. I would have failed any college freshman for doing what Howard Zinn does. All he does is he just sort of rearranges a few words, substitutes a few words, but essentially it's all Hans Koning. Hans Koning also quotes Columbus's journals. Zinn also quotes from parts of Columbus's journals, but he quotes very selectively. He says he attributes what he's saying about another tribe that sees them as being good servants and wants to attack them. He claims that Columbus is saying that about himself, that Columbus is saying they would make good servants. We can make them do what we want. And then there are ellipses. And ellipses, the four dots usually indicate the end of a sentence or a sentence, maybe two. Well, he eliminates 2 days worth of journal entries. And within those 2 days worth, you understand that he believes that we can convert them by love. Zinn leaves out the fact that he wants to save their souls with love. So he gives the exact opposite impression of what Columbus's goals were.
And let's talk more about, I think this will be really fascinating to people who maybe are not that learned about what Columbus actually wrote about what was happening at the time and the different histories that are there. And what's the gentleman's name who was the first priest that was a slave owner who actually converted and tried to, what's the gentleman's name? De las Casas, I can't remember.
Yes, De las Casas, Bartholomew de Casas.
You make a very strong argument that there are all these historical writings we have access to. And Zinn basically takes pieces here and here and here and puts them together to make it look like these men had evil intentions. And there were some really bad things that happened, but that were planned aforetime, and that it was because they had no interest in being friendly with the Indians or converting them or coexisting with them, but because they were white, privileged racists who wanted to hunt, pillage, and do barbaric things. And you basically say that because of Zinn strategically leaving out certain timelines or certain acts of good, or one example I think was that Columbus had told his men to do X, and then he left, and a couple of them said, well, screw that, we don't care what Columbus says, and they went out and did some horrible things, and Columbus gets blamed for it, and Zinn basically accuses that of being Columbus's plan the whole time. And that type of mentality and mindset is basically steeped throughout the chapter. To give
Morrison, well, he also, he admitted that Columbus did not have control of his men all the time. And so you had, abuses, were committed, but that was not Columbus's goal. And Columbus, was named after Christopher Columbus, the saint of travelers. He was an explorer. So yeah, bad things did happen, but that was not Christopher Columbus's intention. His intention was to discover new worlds, and as a devout Christian, to spread Christianity, a noble goal.
One of the things I definitely want to bring up, because I hadn't read it previously, I did an interview with Ramon Ibrahim about all the big battles between Christianity and Islam, and I'd link that in the description so people can check it out, because it's fascinating to think about what these Christians have been going through for 1,000 years ago in this basically struggle for survival. You assert, and I don't know if it's because of Morrison, but you say one of the reasons, he gets criticized for getting lost, for calling them Indians, for not knowing where he's going. But you talk about how there had been a desire and a search for a long time to find new Eastern trading routes to Europe, and it was because of the fact that Muslims had invaded and marauded the land and basically been kicked out of most of their old cities. So Columbus had multiple incentives and reasons for doing what he did, and one of them was because he was looking for allies. And so one of his primary motivations was to find people that could help them take their lands back, and they found the Indians, and he sought to make friends with them. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, he was doing what the Europeans were doing, trying to find a new route to go to reclaim the lands. And, so in 1492, Spain had been taken back from the Muslims and had suffered under Muslim rule. And so he was just trying to find a new route, and instead of going around the Horn of Africa, and that was his goal.
Can we talk about plagiarism a little bit? You do some side-by-side readings, and it's fascinating to hear how much of what he wrote was lifted directly from people who either didn't get credit or didn't say anything about it, didn't complain, didn't register their unhappiness or pursue him for this. And you talk about all the revised editions of the book, how they get mentioned or things get changed, but he hasn't really paid a price like you would assume someone would today for doing the same thing. And you mentioned Ambrose and Irving and other people who didn't get away with similar things and had their reputation stained as a result.
Yeah. One of the most famous cases is Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is recently having a revival. She was kicked off the Pulitzer Board off a PBS show. But yeah, I mean, Zinn's friend, Hans Koning, who I mentioned, who'd written that book for high school students about Columbus, never appears to have said anything. Zinn also plagiarized from Gary Nash. I provide page-by-page quotations. Of course, I didn't have room for all of them. So sure. He plagiarizes from Gary Nash, on his book on Indians and African Americans. there was a professor by the name of Countryman who had written to him and complained that he used his essay in a collection and didn't give him credit. And he said, well, I know I don't want to be uncomradely. So he was on his side.
Right.
So Zinn in the next edition, just really didn't fully acknowledge the debt he owed to this professor named Countryman, but in parentheses, said see his essays in such and such a book. And so yeah, those are three examples of the plagiarism that Zinn committed while he's claiming to uncover new materials.
Oh yeah, and that was a big theme, is that this is all new history he's uncovered that no one's ever really talked about before, and people kind of just let that slide. And so in chapter 2, which I have not read yet, it's called The Life of Zinn. What do we need to know about this man that's going to maybe change our... I read Intellectuals by Paul Johnson last year, and it's this fascinating debate I had with someone who's more highly educated than I am, about whether or not it matters what these people did in their private lives, what type of character they had, and if you can separate their ideas and theories from the things they put in practice in their lives. Kind of that whole Bill Clinton, look, president can do what he wants, he's off the clock, doesn't matter, which of course doesn't apply so much to Trump because he's a horrible person and we have to judge him for the decisions he makes. I've never quite figured that one out. But for Howard Zinn, if we're going to apply that conversation, what is important to know about him as we're reading his pages, what his motivations were, his incentives, and his worldview?
Well, I think the most important thing is that he was a communist. And in his autobiography, he talks about how as a teenager already, he was seeing that the American system could not be reformed, that we had to start over again. So his whole career was dedicated to indoctrinating students about that and writing essays and books for that goal. His goal is to have a revolution, tear the whole system down. And if you read through his book, you see, there are no solutions. Nothing's working in the United States. The civil rights movement didn't work. The women's rights movement didn't work. We just need to tear it down. So that's his goal. And his books are written, and the main book is written, as propaganda for that. The other thing about Howard Zinn, he was a member of the Communist Party. He claimed to be leading students at Spelman College, where he taught on behalf of civil rights. That was not his goal. His goal was to sow discord and basically a civil war, provoke violence. During the Vietnam War protests, he was on the side of North Vietnam, even went to North Vietnam as a publicity stunt with Father Berrigan to bring back 3 American prisoners of war. He would not have, I don't know if he would have survived the Me Too movement. He was fired. Yeah. And this is all public record. He's got 2 admiring biographers, and they write about this. But when he was fired from Spelman College by the first Black and the first male president of the college, by the way, for insubordination, Zinn fought that and basically called Albert Manley, the president, as being like a plantation owner on his college campus.
Racism.
Yeah. But then Albert Manley threatened to reveal a morals charge against Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was quite popular with the young ladies at Spelman College, and he had been caught parked in a car with a young student far from her destination on a dead-end street at about 10 o'clock at night.
He would have been a good Uber driver. Hear stories like that all the time. Missed his calling.
Yeah, he was a notorious womanizer. And his biographers admit that he admitted to having affairs. He thought of leaving his wife. He was, told his daughter when she was 25 that he was in love with another woman. Of course, she was quite hurt by that. But then, excuse me, he decided to stay with Roz, but continued to have flings through the rest of his life. And I've heard stories about his personal behavior around young women, which is pretty bad.
We've mentioned communism a lot, and this gets played down. I have a really good interview with Paul Kengor where he talks about this goal that the communists had to start a race war. And I'm no expert on this, but you touch on it in chapter 7, which you call black mascots for a red revolution. Oh, and before I get into this, I was thinking as you were talking that one of the things I didn't hear much about Zinn until I read your book was all the criticism that was hurled at him from left-wing and leftist intellectuals. You've got Eugene Genovese, if I'm saying it right, who said he was a Marxist and it's really just incoherent left-wing sloganizing, and he refused to review the book. You've got Michael Kamen, who said the book was single-minded, simple-minded history. Kaizen said it was polemic disguised as history. And Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said that he's not actually a historian. So I wasn't aware that there were all these people who came out and said, this guy really doesn't deserve any of the accolades we're throwing at him. How did he overcome that? How has he gotten to a point now where I think the stat is that 84,000 teachers a year in America go and download his material from the Zinn teaching site to teach to their children, to their students?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an indication of the decay of education and knowledge of history. So as time goes on, these critics, some of them die out, they retire, and you have no alternative voices. Conservatives are kept out of academia, so you don't have any challenge to him. And so, Zinn's view becomes the dominant one. And of course, his left-wing allies had good reason to be angry at him because Zinn basically says that all the things that the progressives tried to do, whether it was child labor laws or food safety laws or civil rights, I may have a question about that, but anything that the left wing did, it had no effect. The situation is hopeless. So he doesn't give credit to the leftists, and that's why they were angry with him.
Yeah, you're right. I remember reading that some of the progressives said you basically dismissed all the progress we've made so far. A similar conversation we hear today about discarding all of Barack Obama's accomplishments so that we can move further to the left in our democratic debates. So let's get back to the communism thing. Black mascots for Red Revolution. You had quotes in here from actually Lenin when he took his platform, referred to the quote-unquote Negro problem, which is something you say in the book. You would think students today reading this book would have an issue with how many times he referred to black Americans as Negroes. But he also sought to blame the plight. Tell me if this sounds familiar, people at home. He sought to blame the plight of Negroes and African Americans and their station in life on capitalism and its failures. This is from Lenin's original points on communism. And so tell me what Zinn and Lenin had in common, what they were trying to accomplish, what you talk about in terms of black mascots for Red Revolution. What does that mean?
Well, the communists used African Americans in order to start a civil war. That's what they wanted. Right from the beginning, that blacks were sent out into the streets in hopes of starting a riot. They, get their heads knocked in by the police. And then, of course, there would be outrage about that and protests. So that's been going on since 1919. Howard Zinn wants to continue that. So the protests in the 1960s, if they were peaceful, he doesn't like it. The reforms that were made matter not at all.
he glorifies riots. He thinks they're just great. He glorifies what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did. He wants, if people die, he's happy about it. I mean, he presents it as, this martyrdom for a wonderful cause. And he completely misrepresents African Americans who were rightfully suspicious of the communists, who, for the overwhelming majority of them, hated the communists and knew that they were there just to exploit them. But Howard Zinn says that the communists were the only people who showed any concern for African Americans, about lynching, about segregation, and so forth. I mean, that's patently false. They were there to exploit them. And I also point out the case of Lovett Fort Whiteman, just one of them who died in the Gulag after being lured over to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I learned about him originally from Ken Gore, that he was lured over there to be a important person, kind of like a ringleader in the movement, and he had a change of heart when he was in Russia, and they said, okay, you're not of any use anymore, so here's the Gulag. Isn't that about what happened?
Yeah, he wanted to come back, and what actually happened was he didn't get the memo that that the strategy was changing to a common front in 1935. That the tactics were not about attacking America as fascists, but we had to collaborate. And so he criticized a collection of short stories by Langston Hughes that had just come out, and so was put under suspicion. He was accused of being a Trotskyite. His fellow Black communists there, who were there for a meeting, actually collaborated with the Soviet Union, that sent him into exile and then put him on, in Siberia, where he was beaten and starved to death.
So basically, he learned the hard way that Black Lives Matter sometimes.
Well,
when they're doing what's needed.
Yeah, there were others too.
Yeah, it's sad. Trading cotton for votes. So I just want to give people an obviously, there's a lot of different choices they have when they read books. This is a real page turner. You're going to learn a lot of truly, you'll learn things that you didn't learn in school about the things that supposedly you didn't learn in school that Howard Zinn said. Is there anything you learned reading or researching or writing the book that you didn't know before? What's someone really going to come away with that will surprise them when they read your book?
I knew that Howard Zinn was bad. That he was I thought he was exaggerating. I knew he had communist sympathies. I thought he was just putting a spin on history. But it's much more than that. I mean, I was sitting here, I think on a cold January night and reading, the plagiarized passages of, from the Koning's book on Columbus. And I was like, it's like one of those moments. And it's like, you can't believe it. You shake your head and you think, like, as you pointed out, how could people for 40 years now have been fooled by this guy? I went to another book that he put in his bibliography by Douglas Pike, and I started reading it. Now, Zinn presents Douglas Pike's book. He was an American Foreign Service officer in Vietnam, and he wrote a book on the Viet Cong. Zinn, and he was there from like 1960 to 65. Now, Zinn says, quoting from Douglas Pike, that the Viet Cong were teaching the villagers in South Vietnam communication strategies. But if you look at Douglas Pike's book, he does use the phrase communication strategies, but it's in terms of agitprop. Douglas Pike does not say that the Viet Cong were friends or were the allies
of the freedom-loving South Vietnamese. He accused them of genocide. He pleaded with the Americans to come and help the Vietnamese in their fight against these communists who were terrorizing them and using Maoist strategies on them to provoke, conflict among themselves and murdering people. There's that. There are just so many things that have been left out, distorted, are factually untrue, made up. It's just a fraudulent piece of history. It's not just that he hated America. He just lied throughout his book on every single page.
You talk a lot about, and in some of the prep material, the cultural zeitgeist, which I mentioned earlier, the way that you get a generation full of snowflake millennials and AOCs is that you teach their teachers that American history is a lie, and you give them the inside track on what's really going on. And there's a focus on racism and sexism and classism and how horrible of a country and horrible white European people, the plague that they are on the earth, and basically that this is the inevitable outcome of those teachings. So what do we do?
Well, I'm hoping my book will open some eyes, and I hope people will be as shocked as I was. I don't think we've had the tools to attack Howard Zinn, rightfully. A lot of people have, railed against him, attacked him in articles, but no one has uncovered the historical strategies that he's used, the propagandistic techniques. So for students who may be bothered by what their professors are saying about American history and recommending Zinn's book as they are, as I've heard from a student recently, I have the book, I go through it, I have the footnotes, and if anyone wants to dispute what I'm saying, well, let's discuss it on the research I've done from historians that are both on the right and the left, from Howard Zinn's papers at New York University, from the Library of Congress, from the Martin Luther King Jr. Center. So I want to take the discussion over to the facts and to the fraudulence of Howard Zinn's history.
And when you were talking, it reminded me that I read in the book that the people's history spans supposedly 1492 to present, but what's the percentage of it that is focused on everything from basically the last 50 years of his lifetime, which is the 30s onward? I can't recall the stat.
I can't recall it right now either, but yeah, there's an inordinate amount of material on the 1960s, which, of course, was the goal of Howard Zinn, when he saw, protests all over the country, students, rising up, riots. That was his glory period. He did not like, the 1980s at all. I mean, he wrote it in the late 1970s, but he thought that in the 1960s, we almost got there. We almost had a communist revolution. But sadly for him, we didn't.
Ironically, I think Paul Johnson was the one who referred to the 1960s as America's suicide attempt. So now this is our
communist, yeah.
This is our rehab period. Mary Grabar is a PhD. She taught college for 20 years. You can find her writings at the Federalist Town Hall, Front Page, City Journal, American Greatness, and Academic Questions. The book is Debunking Howard Zinn, exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America. If you're looking for a good read and a very enthralling page turner, I highly suggest you go out and read it, especially if you have friends in the teaching profession or children of teachable or grade school, high school, college age. Mary, the book released on August 20th, right? So everyone can go out and get it right now?
Yes, any place books are sold.
Well, I have really, really enjoyed it. I feel like the least I can do is help you sell more copies and get the message out there. And hopefully Howard Zinn will have his Bill Clinton moment in the next 10 or 20 years where everyone looks at him and says, this guy's kind of gross. Like, why did we let him do the things he's gross? Mary, thank you so much. Any final words?
Well, like I said, I welcome debate, and I hope students pick this up. They need the ammunition, and I appreciate your support and letting me expand on what's in the book. There's so much more in it, and I hope it will be very helpful to students and to our country and to general readers who are also have been taken in by Howard Zinn and want to fight his lies.
Go grab it on Amazon or Audible. Check it out. Give it as a gift. There's 2.8 million copies of People's History of the United States, and there should be far fewer. But do your part to make sure that people actually know what this man was about. Thank you so much, Mary. Good luck.
Thank you.
His Marxist ideology has impacted generations with books, plays, and even curriculum. But how much do you really know about Howard Zinn? That's next on One Nation. Hello, America. I'm Dr. Jake Jacobs. The English rock and roll band The Who, in their 1969 song, Pinball Wizard, has this to say.
Ever since I was a young boy, I played the silver ball. From Soho down to Brighton, I must have played them all. But I ain't seen nothing like him in any amusement hall. That deaf, dumb, and blind kid sure plays a mean pinball.
Ever since I was a young boy, I played the silver ball. From Soho down to Brighton, I must have played them all. Well, I have actually been from Soho down to Brighton when I attended the University of Brighton in 1980 studying American and European history. I was introduced by a very left-wing professor to an American history textbook titled A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, a self-proclaimed communist socialist professor at Boston University.
You want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass.
Ah, Good Will Hunting. Zinn considered himself a social justice warrior who used his teaching platform, books and plays, as a tool to influence his students into transforming the United States of America into a socialistic state. A People's History has been assigned reading in many high schools and colleges across the United States and has sold over 2 million copies since 1980. Now, the problem with Zinn's very popular work, besides its failure to actually footnote his research, it is a twisted, perverted history that is anti-capitalistic, anti-Christian, anti-republic, and it's designed to fulfill his socialistic aims. Now, let's be honest, the United States, it's not a perfect nation. No nation in history has been. I have been teaching the good, the bad, and the ugly about American history for well over 30 years now. However, with that being said, the United States of America is still a wonderful and exceptional nation whose good has brought life, liberty, equality, and justice for millions and millions here and across the world. Now, sadly and unfortunately, Comrade Zinn only focuses in on the sin and the bad and the ugly in America as he attacks our founders as money-grubbing charlatans and traditional Christian values as bourgeois claptrap. Zinn is so in our culture and colleges that his friend, Hollywood actor Matt Damon, recommended that people should read Zinn's A People's History in the movie Good Will Hunting. Do you remember that line from The Who, from Soho down to Brighton? Well, Soho is an area in the West End of London, England, and it's where, in a London pub called the Red Lion, Karl Marx wrote much of this notorious evil book he titled The Communist Manifesto. Well, Howard Zinn, a lover of the Communist Manifesto, and its author, Karl Marx, actually wrote a play called Marx in Soho. Now, Zinn's Marxist play depicts a resurrected Marx who now lives in Soho, New York City, and he defends his communist ideas versus the 100 million plus people killed in his name. Marx in Soho amounts to a clarion defense of the principles of Marxism and the so-called wonderful ideas of Karl Marx's scientific socialism, where capitalism will be destroyed along with any nation that practices such free enterprise activities. Zinn's books and plays and teachings are primarily a diatribe against the United States of America and a defense of the evil ideas of Marxism. Zinn's works are so popular in high schools and colleges, they've actually created a Zinn education project that provides lesson plans, curriculums, conferences, and seminars where literally tens of thousands of teachers across this country are indoctrinated with Zinn's sins against our republic under God. That God Zinn hates passionately and taught against him all the time. Now, while Howard Zinn died in the year 2010 AD, he still lives on in his books and his plays and in his disciples, many of whom have become teachers in our high schools and our colleges today.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender! For without victory, there can be no survival.
Oh, I love Churchill. Every time I hear his speeches, I just get chills up my spine. You'd do well to study Winston Churchill's speeches and his leadership. He's an amazing leader during World War II. Now, I just went to the movie Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill becoming the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the midst of National Socialism's dark and evil reign over Europe. Now, while I do have a problem with some of the historical inaccuracies, I would highly recommend seeing this film as you get a sense of the oratorical and leadership skills God so blessed Winston Churchill with. And like Churchill in his finest hour speech during Europe's darkest hour of Christ-hating socialism, we here in America see similar darkness as the lies of Marx and Dawkins and Darwin and Zinn continue to poison our children within. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, we Christians shall never surrender, and upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. And I really, truly thank God that schools like Freedom Project Academy exist to counter the lies, the deception, and the twisted history by organizations like Zinn Education Project. This is Jake Jacobs. May the God of Israel bless you. And until next week, always remember, the truth will set you free. If you thought that was cool, check out more videos on freedomproject.com. You'll enjoy them.